Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today and for really spending this wonderful week in Greeley. I'm a physician, lung specialist, and over the years I've done a lot of public speaking about the dangers of smoking, air pollution, treating emphysema, tuberculosis. But today I'm going to be talking about something that's much closer to my heart and something that's really, in some ways, more difficult. I'm going to tell you the story of what happened to my family during the Holocaust. I can't begin to tell you, or try to tell you, what happened to 6 million Jews or any of the millions of others who were killed during the Nazi era from 1933 to 1945. For that, you'd have to go to Washington to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. All I can tell you is what happened to one small family. But what I'm asking you to do is to multiply what happened to that family of about 5 or 6 members 1,000,000 times over to get a feel of what the Holocaust was really all about. So I'm going to be showing photographs as I speak, and they will be projected to either side. And this first photograph is a woman holding a child, and I just wonder whether anyone here might venture a guess as to the nationality of the woman holding the baby. Or what part of the world do you think she comes from?
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia, actually very good. This woman actually came from Indonesia. Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and she came to Holland in the early 1900s. She came from a very poor background in Indonesia, and she basically came to find work. And so, like many other immigrants, the only work that she could find, since she was illiterate, was working in a kitchen in an Indonesian restaurant. So the next question I have is really, who do you think the baby is that she's holding? It's me. And I was not born in Indonesia. I was born thousands of miles away in Holland. So I'm going to tell you the story of how it was that this woman born in Indonesia came to be connected with this little baby thousands of miles away, and how their lives became intertwined so that that woman ended up saving that baby's life, so that that baby could stand before you today and tell you the story of his family. Well, I'll begin by telling you a little bit about my parents. They were born in part of the world that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the First World War. My father was born in a small town of what is now Poland. After the First World War, that part of the world became Poland. My father was born in a town called Kędzierzyna, and my mother in a neighboring town called Rymanów. Now, many of you may have seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, and you develop this caricaturish image of these little villages that had a large Jewish population, sometimes in Yiddish called shtetls. But in actual fact, one of the people who came from Rymanów, from my mother's hometown, was a man by the name of Isidor Rabi. Isidor Rabi emigrated to the United States, became a physicist, and ended up being awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1946 for the discovery of electromagnetism. So a really big brain coming from one of those tiny little towns, which makes you wonder how many of those other brains were lost during the Holocaust and ended up among the ashes of Auschwitz. And this is actually a photograph of my grandparents with my little cousin Yossi. He and his parents lived in Berlin, and they had come to visit my grandparents. Well, opportunities were very few in those towns, and there was also, when they became part of Poland, considerable anti-Semitism. So when my parents were about 18 years old, like many other young people, they decided to make their fortune elsewhere and seek opportunities in other countries. So my father left home and went directly to the Netherlands, to Holland, where he started a men's clothing business in The Hague. My mother instead went to Berlin, where she joined two older siblings who had preceded her. Berlin was really the go-to city at that time for young people who really wanted to advance themselves. But my mother arrived in Berlin just about the same time that Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was being published. And that's the book, of course, in which he sets forth his whole racist ideology. The racist ideology that really became the basis for the whole Nazi era, especially for the elimination of Jews. But my mother was only 18 years old. She really wasn't interested in politics, and she was much more interested, and certainly wasn't interested in reading Adolf Hitler's book. She was much more interested in playing with her two little nephews. My little cousin Norbert on the left, Yossi on the right, and in the background, my aunt Helen, Norbert's mother. Well, my mother remained in Berlin until the end of 1932. And then she came to Holland and was married to her sweetheart, my father, just, as I said, at the very end of 1932. The end of 1932 is also the exact time that Adolf Hitler approached the aging president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, who was a major hero of the First World War, and asked him to be made Chancellor of Germany. Paul von Hindenburg had no great use for the Nazis or for Adolf Hitler, but he felt that he could contain him by giving him a minority government. But very quickly, that evolved, and Adolf Hitler really became not just the Chancellor, not just the Prime Minister, but really truly the Führer, the leader of Nazi Germany. But in Holland, Jews felt very secure. They had lived there for hundreds of years. They occupied all segments of society, the arts, Justice Department, ministries. And so my parents made many, many friends, most of them not Jewish, and my father's business flourished. And so in July 1936, they celebrated the birth of their first child. That was my sister Eva. July 1936 is also the precise time when the infamous Berlin Olympics were held, which Adolf Hitler tried to turn into an instrument of Nazi propaganda. So here you have it, a very happy occasion in Holland, and just a few hundred miles away, the next step in the development, really, of the Nazi era. Another picture of my little sister Eva when she was about 6 months old. The next major step that occurred in the development of the Nazi era and of the persecution of the Jews occurred during the night of November 9th, 10th, 1938. That's when the full fury of anti-Semitism was unleashed in Germany and in Austria. And during that night, hundreds of synagogues were destroyed. Thousands of Jewish businesses were plundered, so much so that there was so much scattered glass that it became known as Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass. So the remaining Jews, of course, tried desperately at that point to leave Germany. There had been no talk at all of killing Jews at that point. Nothing. It was hinted at, certainly in Hitler's writings, that he wanted to eliminate the Jews, purify, the German country, purify, getting rid of all the foreign elements in Germany. But nothing overt. But there was tremendous pressure, certainly, for Jews to leave Germany so that they could really go on making a living and be free of all the restrictions and humiliations that had been placed on them in Germany. Among the very last ones to leave was my uncle Abraham, or Adolf in German, and he managed to find one of the very few places that was willing to take in Jewish refugees. And that was a country in South America, Bolivia. Then a very poor country, and still today a very poor country. So if you look at this picture, on the left you can see the little boy in the checkered shirt. That's my little cousin Norbert, the one you met earlier. His mother is sitting on the far right. And then they're on a ship bound for South America. And ironically, just within the last few weeks, actually, I found out who the other little boy is, the one who's very studious with a book. Well, his name is Udi Knapfelmacher, and he ended up in Bolivia and then coming from Bolivia to the United States, and he just retired as head of the Department of Comparative Literature at Princeton University. So here you have it, already being very, very studious on board the ship bound for South America. Well, 3 days after Kristallnacht, 3 days after that horrible, horrible event in Germany, just a few hundred miles away, my mother gave birth to her second child, and that was my sister Leah. Another happy occasion, but at this time, none of my parents' relatives were allowed to come and celebrate with them, the ones who were living, in Germany or in Poland, certainly. Another happy occasion while these terrible events were unfolding in Germany. Now, not all Jews, of course, were able to find refuge in a country, far removed from Germany. Some of them barely managed to cross from Germany into Holland, across the border. And one of the last ones to cross was this man, my uncle Emil, my father's brother. And he now joined our family. And here's a photograph of the family enjoying a nice day in the park. Again, trying to go on with normal lives while all these horrors are occurring just a few hundred miles away. My uncle Emil on the left holding my little sister Leah, my father holding my sister Eva, and my mother sitting in the middle. Well, the next major turning point in the history of the Holocaust in Holland occurred May 10th, 1940. That particular evening, my parents had been asked to host a man who was a member of the Dutch resistance movement. He had a briefcase with him in which he had plans to preemptively destroy the big railroad center in the city of Utrecht. It was felt that if that railroad center were destroyed, it would slow down any invasion coming from Germany. But that morning, my parents and their guests turned on the radio, and they heard that the port city of Rotterdam had been bombed and destroyed. A few minutes later, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands came on the radio and announced that Holland had surrendered. And she asked people to continue to do their duty wherever they happened to find themselves. Well, the first one to speak up was my parents' guest, the man from the Dutch resistance movement. And he said in Dutch, "God dank, het is ten einde." Thank God, it's over. As far as he was concerned, he had been part of the resistance movement. He had tried to slow down any invasion coming from Germany, and he now would have to accommodate and live under an occupation. But my parents, looking at their little children, perhaps in a playpen just like this, knew what had happened in Germany, knew what had happened to their relatives still living in Poland, and understood that they were going to be in for a very rough time. And indeed, within just a matter of days, all of the restrictions, all of the humiliations that had been placed on Jews in Germany over many years were put in place in Holland in just a matter of days. The first thing that happened was a ban on the ritual slaughter of animals. It was felt that, perhaps, but people felt, well, maybe that's a humane gesture. So people didn't pay too much attention to that. That was, the slaughter for kosher meat. But the next thing that happened was that Jews had to surrender, or really had to register all their property. So it would be easier, ultimately, for the property to be confiscated. Jewish men had to take a new middle name, Israel. Jewish women, a new middle name, Sarah, so that they could always, on all their documents, be identified as being Jewish. And then there were some regulations that really made very little sense at all. Jews being banned from using public transportation, and Jews being banned from public parks. Now, if you have a regulation that really doesn't make any sense, like being banned from going into a public park, you tend to ignore it. And so my mother did take the baby carriage with my little sister Leah into a park. And one day, while she was in the park, a German woman approached the baby carriage. And my mother's heart almost stopped, she told me, because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. But then the woman came over to the baby carriage, played with my sister's blonde curls, looked at her blue eyes, and she turned to my mother and she said, you can tell that this is good German Aryan blood. The stereotype that she had in her mind, of course, fostered by Nazi ideology of the ideal blue eyes and blonde hair. Well, my mother thanked the woman and, of course, never went back into that park again. Well, my family tried to go on with their lives, even under the occupation. And so for my mother's birthday, photographs were taken of the family. This is what a selfie was like in the 1930s. And my little sister Eva doing a little dance for the photographer. Well, we are now in early 1941, and this is the time when my mother found out that she was pregnant again. She consulted her obstetrician, and he told her in no uncertain terms to have an abortion. He told her that it would be immoral to bring another Jewish life into the world. Well, my mother wasn't particularly religious at the time, but she did turn to the Bible for advice. And she read the story of Hannah. Hannah, you might recall, was a woman who was desperate to have a child and would go to the temple every year and pray that she might conceive. And it was in reading Hannah's agonizing desire to have a child that my mother decided she could not possibly have an abortion. And like Hannah, my mother made a pledge. If the Almighty will give me a child, I will give that child to the service of God all of the days of his life. Well, her obstetrician was very angry, fired her as a patient, and so November 23rd, 1941, I was born at home with the help of a nurse. And this brought about another dilemma in Jewish life, because Jewish baby boys traditionally are circumcised when they're 8 days old. And my parents' friends said, don't have him circumcised. It will identify him as being Jewish. But this time, the answer to my parents' dilemma came in the form of a worried look on the face of the pediatrician who had just examined me. And my father asked him, is there anything wrong with the baby? And The pediatrician smiled and said, "No, it's nothing serious. It's just that your son needs a minor operation that we call a circumcision." So my father told him of our Jewish tradition, and indeed, 8 days later, the family gathered in our living room to observe this first milestone in a Jewish life. If you look closely in these photographs, you can see my two little sisters really next to my father. And then here I am, somewhere on the pillow in this photograph. What makes these two pictures, very special is that they're only about 1 by 1.5 inch in size. And my mother was to keep those two little photographs hidden on her body through her subsequent stay in 12 concentration camps. She developed this feeling, this superstition, that if she ever lost those photographs, it would mean that I had been killed. Fortunately, my mother survived, the photographs survived, and I survived. And these photographs, of course, are so fragile, so valuable, that I did not want to keep them in the house, and they are now part of the collection of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Well, here's a picture with my two little sisters. This is probably taken when I was about 8 months old or so. And this is a time when my father, like many other Jewish men, were receiving notices to report for labor duty. This is probably roughly May 1942. And they knew, and my father knew, that meant going to a concentration camp in Holland. And so this was a signal for the family to go into hiding. The first one to go into hiding was my father. He pretended to commit an act of suicide, and that gained him admission to a psychiatric hospital where he pretended to be a patient. The next ones to be placed were my two sisters. A very devout Catholic woman had a dream in which she said she saw the Virgin telling her to take Jewish children into hiding. She told her priest about it. His name was Father Ludders. And Father Ludders told my parents' neighbors, and then my parents' neighbors told my parents. And so my parents entrusted my two little sisters to that very devout Catholic woman. And here's a photograph of my two little sisters participating in a Catholic procession, assuming their new Catholic identity. This left my mother alone in the house with me. My mother said that was a particularly difficult, frightful time for her. She said, that she was afraid of the doorbell ringing, and that it might mean, that some Nazi officer was coming to the house to search it. And so she dampened the doorbell with a piece of cloth so that it wouldn't clang. And then she told me she was so afraid that she would spend the whole night sitting on the stairs watching the clapper of the bell to make sure it wasn't moving and there wasn't anyone coming to the house. And finally my mother found a place for me. Jewish male boys are more difficult to place, but finally a neighbor across the street, a woman who knew our family very well, a woman by the name of Annie Madna, agreed to take me in. And that's when my mother closed the house where we had been living on Zoutmanstraat in The Hague for the very last time. And then she joined my father in the same psychiatric hospital where he was, but in her case, playing the part of a nurse. Well, Annie Madna, where I had been left, got scared. She had had some bad run-ins with the Nazis, and so she was afraid that they might discover me. So she passed me on first to her sister. It turned out that her sister had a neighbor who was a member of the Dutch Nazi Party. Holland had the second largest Nazi party in Europe, second only to Germany. So she got scared. She was afraid that this man might hear a baby's cries and wonder what kind of baby this woman had in her home. And so she passed me back to her sister, to Annie Matna. And finally, Annie Matna decided to pass me on to her ex-husband. She had been married, but was divorced, and her ex-husband was actually a man born in Indonesia. And his name was Tole Madna. He had come with his mother in the early 1900s from Indonesia to Holland. His mother couldn't stand the Dutch climate, much too cold, and so she went back to Indonesia, but he remained behind and eventually became the manager of an Indonesian restaurant. And he had a worker in the restaurant, a woman from Indonesia, who we thought was very gentle, very nice, and so he hired her to be a nanny for the 3 Matna children. And her name was Mima Saina. And here's a photograph of Mima Saina caring for the 3 Matna children. A photograph taken about 10 years before I entered the household. She's holding Rob Matna, and then in the middle is Will Matna and Devi Matna on the far right. And then we come to this picture 10 years later, where she is holding me. Mima was completely illiterate. She couldn't read or write. She did not speak the Dutch language at all. She only spoke the Indonesian language, but she had a heart of gold. And this woman now became my mother. She would walk miles every day just to get milk for me. I was in the house illegally, so there were no ration coupons for me, so she had to scrounge around just to get any kind of food for me. I slept in her bed, and she kept a knife under her pillow, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me. Actually, a few years ago, I was in Holland, and a woman stopped me and said, "You know, you used to drink my milk." So I asked her, I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, all children in Holland were given a small bottle of milk in school. And my mother told me to save half that little bottle for the baby next door. And you were the baby next door." So here you have an example of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, already being taught to save a human life. You know, the memories, I have very, very few memories. I was left with the Madna family when I was about 11 months old. 9 months when I was with Annie Madna, 11 months when I was with Papa Madna, as I called him, for the rest of his life. And here's a photograph, you know, of the whole family, or part of the family. Papa Madna on the right, Devi Madna in the middle, Mima holding me, and Will Madna holding a little dog. So Jewish children who were placed in hiding were all given a new name, and I was given the name Bobby. And to this day, when I correspond or speak to the Madna family, that's what they still call me, Bobby. That's what it's going to be for the rest of my life. So for many years, I thought that I was called Bobby after the little dog. The theory being that if strangers heard Bobby being called, they would assume that it's they're calling the dog. They wouldn't realize that there is a little child illegally living in the household. So I told that story to Devi Madna, the one who's standing in the middle there. She's now 88 years old. I told her that story about 2 years ago, and she started to laugh. And she said, no. She said, the dog's name wasn't Bobby, the dog's name was Teddy. So there went, that whole theory. So I was probably called Bobby after the third of the Madna child, the one standing in the middle, right behind me behind me in my tricycle. And his name was Rob or Robbie Madna, also very close to Bobby. So the same theory. People hearing Bobby being called, they say, well, they're just calling Robbie. And interestingly, there are two other children in this photograph. So I was not allowed out of the house at all. I wasn't even allowed to come near a window for fear that someone might look in and see a child that did not belong there, that did not look like the other Madma children. The only view I had of the outside world was what I could see through a mail slot. But I was allowed to go into the backyard, and these two little kids were allowed to come in from the outside and play with me. And the reason that they were trusted was that their parents were German, but they were German communists, and so they were staunch anti-Nazis and were therefore trusted to come in and play with me. Here's another picture of Papa Madna holding me, Mima to the side. And sometimes what's on the back of the photographs is really interesting. And here it says, and here's Mima holding my son, Bobby, because that's what Tole Madna or Papa Madna called me for the rest of his life. I was always his son. Well, we left my parents hidden, in that psychiatric hospital. And while I was living happily, with the Madna family, yes, periodically the house was searched, and I remember having to hide in a closet, but that's where the family kept all of their Christmas decorations. What I remember very distinctly is playing with those Christmas decorations. I also remember, at a time, my two foster sisters doing their homework, and writing, and me trying to imitate them with a pen and scratching some notes, and then they started to laugh. And what I remember is really getting angry at them because they were making fun of me. But, all my memories really with the Madna family are very, very happy ones. Well, my parents only remained in the psychiatric hospital for about 2 months. Then they and all of the staff and all of the people, all of the patients in that hospital were sent to concentration camp in actually New Year's Day, 1943. And this is my mother's registration card in Westerbork, the first concentration camp that they were in. They remained in Westerbork for a few weeks and then were transferred to another camp on Dutch soil called Vught, near the city of Eindhoven. And that's where they did forced labor, slave labor, for the Philips electronics factory. That's where my mother found out that one thing that was essential for the German war effort was manufacturing radio tubes. And so she learned how to assemble radio tubes in the hope that would keep her alive. My mother told me that one day the prisoners had to form a lineup very early in the morning so they could be addressed by a very high Nazi official. His name was Heinrich Himmler. And Heinrich Himmler exhorted the prisoners to work for the success of the Reich. He told them that if you continue to work for the success of the Reich, nothing bad will ever happen to you. My mother told me that while he was speaking, she spotted the spire of a small Dutch church way off in the distance. Holland is very flat, almost like the area around Greeley, but there are no mountains there at all. And so she saw the spire of this small Dutch church way off in the distance. And she said to herself, it would be so wonderful if peace were to break out at this moment and I could just run to that church, fall on my knees, and thank God for having been freed. She didn't care whether it was a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, just a place where she could thank God for having been liberated. But that wasn't to be, and Heinrich Himmler did not keep his promise, and 3 months after his speech, all the prisoners in Vught, in Philips Electronics, were taken to Auschwitz. And it was in Auschwitz that my parents were separated. My father remained in Auschwitz for about 6 months before he was sent on to other camps. My mother was sent on immediately to a place called Reichenbach in Upper Silesia, where she did continue to do slave labor for the electronics factory, this time of what is now the Siemens factory, or Telefunken at the time, doing the same kind of work, assembling radio tubes. Now, by then, my mother said she already felt some encouragement that the Nazi era might be coming to an end at some point, because what gave her encouragement was that alongside her, there were German soldiers working who had been repatriated from the Eastern Front, from Russia. They had lost an arm or a leg, were no longer fit for duty, and so were assigned to work in this factory. They had become so anti-Hitler that they did everything possible to sabotage the workings of the factory. My mother told me they would toss parts that they were working on over their shoulder and scream, "The one is for Hitler, this one is for Himmler, this one is for Goering." Just really gross sabotage of the factory. And that encouraged my mother and others to engage in their own little acts of sabotage. So my mother told me that she would spend a whole day assembling a radio tube, and then at the end of the day, when the siren was sounded to go back to the barracks, she would disassemble the radio tube, put the parts back in the drawer, and start the process all over again the following day. She also told me of some remarkable acts of defiance that the prisoners, the women especially, engaged in. So she told me how they continue to observe certain Jewish holidays, especially the holiday of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is when it celebrates the rediscovery of the temple, and it's when Jews light a menorah, candles, to celebrate the holiday. So my mother told me that the women would go to the infirmary, tell the nurse that they were having their menstrual period and that they needed wads of cotton. And then they would take these wads of cotton, fashion them into wicks, dip them into the oil from the machines that they were working on, and then finally planting them in a potato. That was the only kind of food that they received. And then in the evening, light them to celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah. A major, really important act of defiance that I have no doubt kept these women alive. Eventually, my mother witnessed the bombing of the factory by the Allies, and she said the traditional Jewish prayer of thanks to God for having survived to see that day and having lived, to see that factory going up in flames. It wasn't the end of her ordeal, because the Germans did not just free, the prisoners at that point. What they did is they put them on marches from one camp to the other. And that's how my mother ended up in a total of 12 different concentration camps. They were called death marches, well described by Elie Wiesel in his book, Night. But fortunately, my mother survived. And her last concentration camp was one close to the Danish border. And that's where she was liberated through the intervention of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was the head of the Swedish Red Cross. And my mother told me that one of the amazing memories that she had was that Count Folke Bernadotte, this member of the Swedish, close to the Swedish monarchy actually, that this man is insisted on embracing every one of the prisoners as they came off their cattle cars, off the trains, and were transferred into a bus. And how embarrassed she felt to have this man insisting on hugging her. My mother then went on from Denmark, where she was liberated, to Sweden to recuperate. And so fortunately, that was what happened to my mother. The story of my sisters is not anywhere like mine. Sadly, the husband where my sisters were hidden denounced his own wife as hiding 2 Jewish children. And so his wife was taken, put in prison, eventually freed, but my 2 sisters were immediately taken to Auschwitz, where they were killed. They were only 6 and 8 years old at the time. And this is page 137 of people deported from Holland to Auschwitz. And I can't point out from here, but in the yellow square, the top one, you can see the name of my younger sister, and she had a new name, Annie Madna, because that's her assumed name while she was in hiding. And then below that is the same kind of thing for my older sister, for my sister Eva. But next to my younger sister, the top square, you will also see the name Emil Münzer, spelled the Dutch way, E-M-I-E-L. That's the same Uncle Emil that I mentioned earlier, the man who had joined our family. Now, people who arrived in Auschwitz were either immediately killed, no further records were kept on them, or they were very carefully registered. And I recently came across the registration form, for example, for my father. But there was no registration form for my uncle, for the man Emil. So it's just within the past 2 weeks that in speaking to a researcher at the Holocaust Museum, we found out what happened to Emil. And the strong likelihood is that he realized that my 2 sisters were part of the same transport of prisoners in Auschwitz, and he decided to try and protect them. So he remained with them, and he was killed alongside with them in the gas chamber. And it's a story that, as I said, I have just discovered. This is the death certificate for one of my 2 sisters. It's really not a true death certificate, but it's issued by the International Red Cross, showing exactly the date in February when they were killed. And you can see the trace of a red rubber stamp, which in German says, a time of death administratively determined. Could not be exactly determined, obviously, because 1,000 people would be put in the gas chamber at a time. So the precise time of death was unknown. Well, I was reunited with my mother in August 1945. That's when she was sent back from Sweden to Holland. And that's the first very clear memory that I have. I remember being asleep in one of the back rooms of the Madna house, and Devi Madna, my foster sister, coming to get me, waking me up, and then carrying me into the living room where the whole family was sitting in a circle. And what I remember was I was cranky, so they did what you do with a cranky child. They passed it from one lap to the other. And what I remember was that there was one lap I refused to sit in. A woman I kept pushing away. And that, of course, was my own mother, who was a complete stranger to me. I already had a mother, and that was Mima Saina, the Indonesian woman who had taken care of me all those years. And that's the language that I grew up with, and the language that I learned to speak, the Indonesian language. Well, my mother knew that it would be very hard to separate me from Mima. She also knew that she would have to go out and try to make a living. So she decided that Mima would continue to take care of me. But just to get me used to being alone with her, my mother one evening told me she gave Mima a ticket to go see a movie, somewhat of a novelty after the war years. So Mima took the ticket, left the house, and then 5 minutes later came back into the house and wagged her finger at my mother and said, "Don't hit him." That's how protective Mima Saina was of me, that she did not even trust my own mother to take care of me. Well, Mima continued to care of me for about 3 months, but then in October 1945, Mima suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and passed away. And I have almost no memories of this Muslim, Buddhist woman who took care of me, who really was my first mother. All I remember is visiting her grave, which I did many, many times. So much so that many years later, when I went back to Holland, and Papa Madna took me to the cemetery, I was immediately, able to find the grave because I had been there so many times with him. It also had become the final resting place for one of Papa Madna's favorite canaries. He kept canaries, and one of them passed away. I remember one of my childhood memories is, putting that little canary in a cigar box and burying it in Mima's grave. Only memory that I really have of her. Well, I haven't told you yet what happened to my father. This is a little piece of paper that I found in the archives of the Holocaust Museum, part of the International Tracing Service documents that the Holocaust now has custody of. And it has my father's name on the upper right-hand corner, number in the upper right-hand corner. There is no name. His number as a prisoner in Auschwitz. It has a date. And then it says premium employee. So I asked, the researchers, I said, what does this mean? And he said, well, all of the slave laborers earned a salary. And that salary had to be paid by the factory to the Nazis, to the SS. That's how Adolf Hitler continued his war. And, it just illustrates, and your father, warranted a higher salary, premium employee. Part of the whole bureaucracy that the Nazis, set up to create the Holocaust. Well, my father, as I said, remained in Auschwitz for about 6 months. He was then transferred to a camp called Mauthausen. And this is his registration form in Mauthausen. And it actually, again, part of the whole bureaucracy, it asked the place of residence of his next of kin, his wife. And it says, concentration camp Auschwitz. It's just, again, part of the crazy, crazy bureaucracy that was set up. And then it has the name of a Gusen, which is the next concentration camp he was transferred to. Mauthausen was a real hellhole of a camp. All of them were, but that one in particular. That's where Jews and non-Jews were forced to carry boulders up a ramp. And then German soldiers would trip people at the top of the ramp so they would fall down. And 100,000 people carrying those boulders found their death that way in Mauthausen. Fortunately, my father survived, went on to Gusen, to Steyr, and then finally to a place called Ebensee. All of those camps from Mauthausen on, located in Austria. Again, same thing. As the Soviet army approached, they left the prisoners from Auschwitz were taken simply to other camps further west. How many of you have seen the movie Sound of Music? Very good, almost everybody. Well, this is where The Sound of Music was filmed. And it's also where the story of The Sound of Music takes place. One of the most beautiful spots in the Austrian Alps. And in that beautiful spot, there was a terrible concentration camp where the inmates, the prisoners, were forced to work in abandoned underground salt mines, building V-2 rockets for the German army. Terrible, terrible working conditions, no food to speak of, and heavy, heavy labor. No wonder that many of them actually died. But fortunately, my father did survive long enough to see liberation by the US Army in May 1945. The 80th U.S. Army. Actually, a few years ago, I met a nurse through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She's about yay tall. And this little nurse, this woman, had a company, was an army nurse, and she had participated in the Normandy, landing at Normandy, crossed all of Europe, and ended up in Ebensee as the one of two nurses accompanying the unit, the 80th U.S. Army that liberated Ebensee. And I spent a whole day with her looking through photographs, because it is very likely that this woman was a link for me to my father. Well, my father was so weak that he passed away 2 months later, 2 months after liberation, July 25th, 1945. So I never really got to know my father at all. The only time I really felt a strong connection to my father, that I understood my loss, is when I visited his grave in Ebensee and stood there and burst out into tears. That's when I really became fully aware of my loss. This is the death certificate issued by the U.S. Army of my father. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you will see the middle name Israel. Ironically, the middle name that was forced on my father and all Jewish men by the Nazis. The middle name Israel. And now that camp is just one huge cemetery. There's that big monument in the middle is actually a mass grave of all of the hundreds of dead bodies that were found when the U.S. Army arrived. My father's grave. Well, life in Holland had to start over again for my mother. She had to make a living, and she acquired a cosmetics store, and that's how she made her living. And here we are, the two of us, in front of her cosmetics store. And then Jewish life started over again in Holland. And here's a photograph taken of the first Purim observance for children in The Hague. Probably 1946, 47, something like that. And Purim celebrates the victory of Queen Esther over the evil Haman. And it's traditional for Jewish kids to dress up for that holiday in costumes. And I was dressed up as a collection box for the Jewish National Fund. And I won first prize with this beautiful costume made entirely by my mother. Well, I remained in close touch with Papa Madna. This is actually the Holocaust Museum's favorite photograph of the two, taken very shortly after the war. I'm wearing glasses because that's one of the first things my mother did when we were reunited, is take me to an ophthalmologist because she thought I was cross-eyed. But, and I hadn't gotten any care as a child, and so she was very worried about all sorts of health issues for me. And as you can see, I wasn't terribly fond of the chickens that he kept in his backyard. He tried to bring a little bit of his native Indonesia into Holland, and that's why, he kept chickens. And when my mother and I left for the United States, he, of course, came to see us off before we boarded the ship, the Rhine Dam. And I'm there with my beret, my mother next to me, and Papa Madna next to me. And then on the far left, he remarried, and that's his second wife, Mary, and he had 3 more children by his second marriage. And I'm sort of the older brother to these 3 and the younger brother to the other 3, sort of the bridge between the 2 families. The only time that they ever got together was when I was there in Holland for a visit. But as I said, I always remained, very close with Papa Madna, always remained part of his family. And here on top of the piano on the left-hand side, you can see my graduation picture from college, and barely visible to the right is my graduation picture from medical school. Papa Madna always considered me his son. Here are the 2 of us in front of the house where I was hidden, my own personal Anne Frank house. And here I am with Will Madna and Rob Madna. Rob Madna became the head of the Netherlands Jazz Orchestra after a long career as a teacher and the high school principal. And here we are with Devi Madna. And then this is the very last picture that I have with Tole Madna, with Papa Madna. It's a picture taken 2 months before he died. People said that he kept himself alive because he wanted to see his son from America one last time. And his final words to me were, "Take care of your mother," because that's the kind of person he was. Much more concerned about the other person than he was about himself. People asked, "Why did you take the risk of hiding a Jewish child? Why did you endanger your family?" And he said, his answer was very simple. He said, "What else was I to do?" For him, there was simply no choice. It was the right thing to do. Even when surrounded by all this evil around them, he and Mima Saina knew to do what was right. This is my very favorite picture of Papa Madna. And the Madna family was honored at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the memorial to the Holocaust, in a garden devoted to the righteous among the nations. And with their names are the only ones that bear the inscription in parentheses, Indonesia. And I continue to tell the story of Papa Madna and his heroism to his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, because I all want them to feel proud and feel and follow the example of their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. And then a few years ago, I had the amazing opportunity of sharing the story with a group of students from Indonesia visiting the United States at Temple University. They were here to learn about religious pluralism, what it is to live in a society where there are many different religions. In Indonesia is 85% Muslim, and there have been a lot of tensions with other religious groups. So these students were here to learn about what it is to live together in a society with many different religions. And I told them the story just the way I told it to you today. And then at the very end, I told them I have one small memory of Mima Saina. And that memory is of a lullaby that she used to sing to me, and it was called Nina Bobo. And the most amazing thing happened. They all started singing it in unison, and I have a short video showing that. I vaguely remember that she used to sing a lullaby to me, and it was called Nina Bobo. And all 25 students started singing the lullaby, Nina Bobo, in perfect unison. Nina Bobo, Nina Bobo, oh, Nina Bobo. All these students from very, very different backgrounds came up to me, hugged me, kissed me, and said that we were all one family. An amazing, amazing moment, which has actually been repeated several times, every time that I speak to a group of students from Indonesia, which I just did a few days ago, actually through the miracle of the internet. We can now have conferences and talk to people all over the world, and and spread a message of love instead of hate. Well, sadly, of course, one of the saddest things to me about the Holocaust, to me the lesson of the Holocaust first, is really that it is possible, even when surrounded by evil, to stand up and do what is right. That's what I tell students, all the groups that I speak to. That's what the Madna family did. Even under these terrible circumstances, they did what was right. But sadly, the other lesson that I take away from the Holocaust, and it's a sad lesson, is because I would have hoped that after I lost my sisters, after I lost my father, and after millions of others suffered the same losses, that would be the last genocide, that everyone else would be spared, that fate of living, without a father or without the companionship of sisters. But sadly, there have been, of course, many genocides since the Holocaust. And even today, there's a near genocide in Burma, conditions in Syria. All of these things make it all the more important for us, to speak up. And that's one reason, really, that I'm here today, is to continue to tell people the dangers of where prejudice and hate can lead, ultimately, to mass murder, and with the hope that future generations might finally learn the lesson and really, really live up to that promise, never again. This is a photograph taken actually with someone who became a very close friend of mine, a child survivor of another genocide. His name is Arnchorn Pond, and he survived the Khmer Rouge genocide. He was taken prisoner when he was 10 years old, and only survived because he learned to play a musical instrument for his captors, which they amplified throughout the camp where he was a prisoner, and so to cover the sound of people's skulls being cracked. They did not have gas chambers. They had to crack people's skulls. But somehow this young man managed to escape, come to the United States, and became a major human rights figure. We spoke together in Scotland, an amazing experience. And here are the two of us. And by the end of the 3 days we spent together, he started telling my story, and I started telling his story. And we formed a tremendous bond that continues to this day. All of us, survivors of genocide, trying to leave this a little bit of a better world. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have.
How did you gradually reconnect with your mother? That must have been
How did I gradually reconnect with my mother? I don't remember all the details. My mother, came to live with us, with the Madna family initially. So there was a bridge there. And then very quickly, I really became attached to her. And then, of course, the fact that Mima passed away probably was a major factor as well. It's really part of a larger question of how I came to understand what was happening immediately as a young child. And the fact is, as a 4 or 5 year old, I had no understanding whatsoever of what had happened to my family. My mother's neighbors had saved notebooks that my sister Eva had written in. And this was when she was only about 6 years old, and she had the most beautiful handwriting. And they would show me these books, these notebooks, and tell me how wonderful Eva was and this beautiful handwriting. And then they would tell me about my sister Leah, who, even though she was very young, was such a good, kind-hearted child. And I actually grew up feeling somewhat jealous of my two sisters because I had no comprehension at all what had happened to them. Then very, very gradually, I began to overhear people saying, such and such a person came back, and that person did not come back. And I began to understand that my sisters had gone somewhere terrible, and did not come back. And that's how this sort of gradually evolved. But I grew up with the Holocaust all around me. Kids who were missing parents, siblings, and for me, playing in a field of rubble because part of the city of The Hague had been destroyed. It was just a normal thing. Other questions?
When did you migrate to the U.S.?
When did you migrate to the U.S.?
We came to the United States in 1958, when I was about 16 years old. Frankly, my mother really wanted to leave all the bad memories of Europe behind her. And that's why we came to America. This was still the country of hope. And it is, it's... Now, we realized when we arrived in the United States that America was far from perfect, because we immediately saw the terrible effects of discrimination and prejudice in the South, and the beginnings of the civil rights movement and people being persecuted. So we realized that this country wasn't perfect, but we also realized that this country had a way of elevating itself and overcoming prejudice and hate.
How can all of this be prevented?
How can we all prevent it? It's really, what I told the kids I spoke to earlier today, I said we really are dependent on the next generation, learning the lesson and saying and learning, that even bullying at their age is dangerous. Bullying, prejudice, hate can lead to mass murder. And we need to learn that lesson as a society, and people have to exercise their vote. They have to speak up when they see hate. And that's, I think, the only thing we really can do. There's no instant cure, unfortunately, but we just have to continue to speak up.
I had the opportunity to teach in China in 1994. And it's interesting. One afternoon, some of the students, I was teaching air traffic control, and one of the students come up and said, "Mr. Don, we're watching a movie and we need you to answer some questions." And the movie they were watching was Schindler's List.
What? The movie that we're watching was
Schindler's List.
Schindler's List.
Schindler's List. And these kids were all in their 20s, I think. And they had been, as strange as it seems, they were raised to believe that the Holocaust never happened. And they wanted to hear it from me. And I told them it did. This was something that really did happen. But are there a lot of countries,
Sure.
do you think, that taught, and now there's even people in the U.S. that are teaching in schools that the Holocaust is a myth?
This is really one of the dangers, unfortunately. You would think that after all these years, after a Holocaust museum, after all the memorials, that people would understand what the Holocaust was about, and that there was a Holocaust, that indeed it's real, that the history is real. It's one of the things that the Holocaust Museum does, is fortunately, now this is one of the good things about the internet, is that we can now reach populations that have never heard about the Holocaust before. So a few months ago, I participated in a movie made by a company called Iran Wire. And it's a company, I think, located in Canada, actually, that broadcasts via the internet into Iran, where there is heavy Holocaust denial, a policy of Holocaust denial. And so they filmed me and some other Holocaust survivors telling their stories, and this was broadcast into Iran. So even in Iran, we managed, to reach people. And it's something that we really have to do. It's one of the reasons that I spoke to these students in Indonesia. And there is hope, because a woman visited the museum a few years ago, just about 3 years ago. She was a journalist in Indonesia, and she took the tour with a docent, and the docent always asks, what country are you from? She said Indonesia. And he said, you have to meet Al Münzer. And so she contacted me. We got in touch. Last year, I was in Cambodia to get together with Arnshorn Pond, and she and her husband flew to Cambodia, interviewed me at length, borrowed many of the photographs that are available from the museum, and created a beautiful documentary showing my whole story. And she showed it at a beautiful festival, a festival she called Festival of Tolerance in Indonesia. And, you know, hundreds of kids attended. And she has shown it elsewhere now. So, again, making use of all those technologies, hopefully we can spread the word, is putting all of those new things to good use. That's really the challenge. There's a lot of bad stuff coming out of there, but also some really good stuff, real potential. One question over there.
When did your little child mind finally start to realize what had happened?
When did I finally realize what had happened? It was a very, very gradual process. It was really overhearing conversations of my mother with other survivors, telling their stories, listening to those, and then gradually absorbing it. And then putting the whole story together happened. Well, my mother had boxes of photographs. This is just the photographs I showed her, just a small sample that were fortunately saved. And, you know, so I asked her to tell me who's in this photograph. You know, photographs from her childhood, other photos. You know, I only showed you a few of them, but there are photos of all of her siblings. You know, she came from a large family. And she and my uncle, who emigrated to Bolivia, are the only two survivors of a family of probably about 8 kids. My same story for my father. So, you know, that's how the story gradually developed. Then, when the television series Holocaust was broadcast, that's when, after that, and had tremendous viewership. After that series, in the 1970s, I guess, I sat down with my mother, took out a big map, and I asked her to tell me exactly what had happened. You know, what concentration camp she had been, at what time, the names of all the camps. I didn't name all of them. I would be going on for hours over here. But it's really when I felt it was important to really reconstruct the whole story and really come to an understanding of exactly what happened. But, you know, in terms of an emotional understanding, that was even slower. So I told you, you know, the time when I really came to grips with what happened to my father was when I stood at his grave and burst out in tears. And I finally came to understand, you know, what I had lost. It's very hard to cry for something you have never known. And same thing is true for my sisters. Yeah, when I see other families gathering, you know, at holidays with all their brothers and sisters, yeah, I get a little bit jealous, you know. And I begin to sense, you know, the loss that I suffered. But at the same time, you know, I'm very fortunate, you know, to have acquired many friends and continue to do so. And having the opportunity to really bear witness, to tell the story of my family, and hopefully leaving an impression, especially on young people, is extremely gratifying to me. And that's why I really, you know, the kids this morning asked me, you know, all sorts of very good questions. And then one kid raised his hand, he said, "Why are you in Greeley?" And my answer was, "Because of you." And they all, you know, started applauding. You know, it's really, so. I think, thank you very much. I really, any last questions? Good. One more.
I just wonder how your mother was able to preserve all these photos.
How was my mother able to preserve all these photos? They were really kept by neighbors. And when my mother got them back, she had difficulty looking at them. So she packed them away in boxes from her cosmetics store. boxes that used to hold soap. I remember those boxes. And eventually, I reconstructed I wrote an essay, actually, My Family in a Box, because I reconstructed the story of my family out of that box by sitting down with my mother, and questioning it. Another question is really, how did my mother survive at all? How did she overcome all of her trials, loss of a husband, loss of 2 beautiful girls? Part of it was having to take care of me, obviously. That was very important. But there was also that sense of defiance, the same defiance that she showed at the Hanukkah holiday. My mother, I think, did not want Adolf Hitler to have the last word. That, I think, is really what motivated her. And her very, very last gesture when she passed away, and I was sitting next to her, was a raise of fist. And she grabbed my arm and wanted me to do the same thing. Because that, I think, defiance is really what really defined my mother and what kept her going.
I think there was
One more question. Do you feel yourself that anti-Semitism started prior to the Austrian corporal, or is that when it really came in?
The history of anti-Semitism, and I'm not a historian, but from what I have read, it really goes back much further. Obviously, to Roman times, if you will, or post-Roman, but not even going that far. But actually, the organized anti-Semitism in that area really began much earlier, in the 1800s, certainly. I'm in the midst of reading a biography of Franz Kafka, and in that book, there's a real good description of early anti-Semitism at that time, starting in Austria. So certainly, it wasn't invented by Adolf Hitler. It started earlier. Okay.
one more way in the back.
Okay.
In a time when prejudice and racism is so sort of prevalent in our society, what can we do as citizens to counter that?
What do I do as a citizen to counter? And I'm doing exactly what I do today, is to bear witness, to talk to people, to speak up. And I'm grateful, especially to the Holocaust Museum, for giving me, that opportunity to do it as much as possible. So, for example, after Charlottesville, I had reporters coming to the house to interview me. And, some of them were very sophisticated reporters from the regular television channels. And then there was one, I'll give you an example of the power of the new media. This one young man came to the house, and all he had, he represented an outfit called mic.com, which I had never heard of. And he came to the house with his iPhone and a tripod, okay? And he interviewed me for about half an hour. I told him my story. Then he went to the archives of the Holocaust Museum, pulled up, the photographs, pulled out some other footage from the Holocaust Museum, put it all together, and the following day, this story appeared through the internet, which ultimately had an unbelievable 14.3 million views. So it just shows, the tremendous power. He was a young man. He was, I think he was maybe 20 years old, maybe not even that, but already participating, in this this new message. He's now gone on to form another company. Actually, he sent me an email. But that's the hope that I hold out, is that, more and more people will speak up. I've also, through the museum, participated in a series of talks about what's happening in Syria, where I'm paired with someone who represents an organization called Syrian Emergency Task Force, Muaz Mustafa. And we have traveled throughout the country speaking together. My experience, his here in the Holocaust, his experience, about Syria. I've also appeared together with someone a former prisoner from Syria, before 2 congressional committees at the same time. Very, very important. Again, trying to bring the issue, the dangers of contemporary genocide, and learning the lessons from the Holocaust to members of Congress. Okay. Thank you very much for being here.